I'm so excited to have my students here from McGeorge to join me on this podcast. Tonight we have Joy Hernandez and Katie, and they are going to talk about the House versus the NCAA. And really, this podcast is going to be for parents. It's actually 101 for parents about House versus NCAA. So Joy, why don't you give me a quick summary of the House versus the NCAA case for parents and high school athletes? What would you tell them if they asked you, what is this case about?
Absolutely. Thank you for having us first. So I'm just going to speak about House as if I'm speaking to somebody who knows absolutely nothing about the case. I'm going to try and use as simple terms as I can, because this is how I learned about the House case. So House was a class action lawsuit where former Division I athletes sued the NCAA. They claimed that the NCAA illegally violated federal antitrust laws by preventing athletes from making money from their name, image, and likeness. Name, image, and likeness refers to things like broadcasting, merchandise, jerseys, pictures, trading cards, endorsements, appearances, things like that. And so antitrust laws are meant to protect fair competition. And so in arguing that the NCAA violated them, the former athletes were arguing that the NCAA and its conferences, through their rules, prohibited athletes from making money and competing in the marketplace, even though their name, image, and likeness was already generating money for the schools, and they were saying that they were entitled to a piece of that pie. So in resolving the case, the parties reached a record settlement that was just accepted this past June. The settlement has 4 main provisions. First, it provides back pay for student athletes who were Division I athletes between 2016 and 2025, and requires that the NCAA and Division I schools pay $2.8 billion in back pay for those students. There's a future aspect for future revenue sharing. Starting this year, some schools are going to be allocating up to $20.5 million a year to issue revenue sharing payments to student athletes, meaning that students will be able to get paid for their performance as athletes at the school. That total allocation is going to increase annually over time, but for this year alone, it'll be $20.5 million. It also issued some new rules regarding rosters and scholarships. Schools aren't going to be restricted by something that used to be called the headcount scholarship model. Schools were restricted to only issuing a certain amount of scholarships. That is now changing, and schools are permitted to offer each student athlete a scholarship in various amounts. So some students may have full scholarships, some students may have partial scholarships, but they won't be restricted on the number that they can provide.
Okay, wait a minute. They won't be restricted on the number they can provide. They can't provide 900. Each sport has a specific number.
From what I understand, the schools, there is a set amount that they can offer, but the pie can be distributed amongst all students is how I read it. If I'm wrong, please.
Well, what I'm trying to explain to you is that each school has a certain amount of roster spots.
Correct.
Okay. In the past, what they did is they limited the scholarships. Like you maybe had 110 roster spots, but you only had 85 scholarships.
Right.
Now, if you have 105 roster spots, you also have 105 scholarships.
Yes, exactly.
Depending on the sport. So I just want to clarify that.
Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely.
Okay.
Thank you for clarifying.
Yeah.
And then it also provides that sports will have roster caps. So each sport is going to have a set amount of students that can be on their roster. There was a kind of unique issue this year with the settlement agreement. Because it was going into effect in June, it meant that some students may have been offered spots on the roster, and by placing roster caps, it could have meant that students would have lost their spot. And so the judge in this case was particularly worried about that and made sure that those students were grandfathered in so that they wouldn't be losing their spots on the roster, losing their scholarship. So that is in place for students that will be playing this year. And
as long as they have been designated as a DSA, which is a designated student athlete.
right,
Correct?
yes.
And it's athletes that were on the roster in 2024,
Mhm.
okay, or were promised, like high school students who are promised to be on the roster for 2025. Those are the only students that they could designate as a DSA, and they have to designate them as a DSA. It doesn't mean every single student in that category got designated that. That's one of the things that's a little bit tricky in this case.
Yeah, that's an interesting issue, so thank you for clarifying that.
Yeah, okay.
And it also created an enforcement mechanism, so there's going to be a new organization, which a few of my classmates are going to talk about later, the College Sports Commission, the CSC, that's going to be overseeing enforcement of these new rules. It's independent of the NCAA. They're going to be enforcing the revenue sharing system, and then they also will be charged with reviewing name, image, and likeness deals, and we'll talk a little bit about what that means in a bit, but they're just going to be making sure that these name, image, and likeness deals aren't really pay-for-play, shrouded as like a contract.
Great. Very good explanation. Okay, so Katie, what impact do you think this case is going to have on incoming student athletes? And what are some of the things that parents should be aware of?
Yeah, so I think the first thing that parents really need to be aware of is that athlete compensation is now a reality. NIL and possible school revenue sharing are both legal, so their athlete may get a contract offer that includes revenue sharing. So this is going to be, brand new probably for most parents, and they likely will not know, how to navigate this. So it's important for parents and high school athletes to know whether the school has opted into the settlement, if it's a D1 school. If the school has opted in, that means that it has agreed to give up to the $20 million or 22% of its athletics revenue for 2025-2026 to athletes across all departments. So your athlete may get some of that money. The school must comply with revenue sharing rules across sports, including roster requirements, which I'll talk about in a minute. If the school has not opted in, it means that it has not agreed to distribute $20 million to its athletes. However, their athlete could still do NIL deals on their own. So that's kind of the first part that's important for the parent to kind of know about, is sort of whether the college has opted in or not. And then in addition, their athlete can opt in or out. And if they opt in, that athlete becomes part of the class that receives the $20 million. If they opt out, let's say, you think your student athlete maybe already has a big name or has the potential to make more money than they might make with the deal, and you feel confident that you could sue later, that might be a reason why you would opt out. However, we would recommend that athletes opt in, because you're really kind of just giving away money if you opt out, because you can always get other NIL deals in addition. And then the second main thing that parents should be aware of is regarding this whole roster spots caps. So now that those have replaced scholarship caps for each sport, it's important to know if your athlete is being offered a guaranteed roster spot. If they are, then that means they get 4 years of eligibility that won't count against their sports roster limit. And if they transfer, they won't count as a new roster spot. So that's important because they'll probably be more attractive to schools who opted in and who need to keep their roster limits and don't have space for additional athletes.
Okay, I do want to clarify though, that is only for student athletes that have been identified as a designated student athlete. You don't get to designate yourself.
Right.
The school, in this case, they had to designate the student athletes that were DSAs by July 6th, 2025. But after this year, you're not grandfathered in. Just be clear. It's only students that were going to be impacted from this incoming freshman class, or people who were, or students who were previously on a roster. But if they didn't designate you, then for whatever reason, you aren't a DSA. Meaning you don't get to designate yourself.
Right.
Okay, so I just want to be clear on that so parents are clear. And $20 million, does that mean that they're going to hand your kid $20 million? What does it mean?
No.
No, it doesn't.
There are other factors that influence,
Yes.
Whether you're going to get any of that 20 million. So that was kind of what we were going to go into next.
Okay, I just want.
Yeah. No.
Okay, so are you ready for the third question?
Yes.
Okay, so this all sounds really fantastic for all these families. So what you're telling me is all student athletes are going to make a ton of money?
So not exactly,
Okay.
unfortunately for parents, but so the funds, so part of the settlement kind of talked about that the schools will likely concentrate the revenue in football and men's basketball. So that's estimated to be about 75% of the revenue sharing will go towards those programs.
75% will go to football.
Okay,
That's the
football.
recommendation.
And then 15% or 15 to 25, I think, for basketball.
What, does anybody know the answer to
10
that?
to 15% for men's basketball.
What'd you say, Sabalta?
10 to 15% for the men's basketball team.
Yes, okay, and then what's going to
And
women's?
5 to 10 for the women's basketball team.
Yeah.
And the remaining 5 for the other sports.
So it will depend, and we do have other students in the class that are going to discuss this more in depth, but it will depend on the kind of revenue being generated by that school. Does a school have to give all 20 million?
No.
No.
They can give up to 20
Right,
million.
there's just a max on it, at least in 2025 and 26.
I think how it will play out in practice is that the amount that it will be allocated towards this will be commensurate to how much revenue the sports are making. And so if you're going to a school that may be D1 and doesn't have super lucrative sports, I don't know much about D1 colleges and where those schools are and if they exist, but it'll be a lot less than, I don't know, like a big Texas school that is probably going to max out at that 20.5. So like some good questions could be, how does your school plan to distribute the money? How much is this particular team getting out of the revenue share? That the decision to allocate a majority of the money to football wasn't just some like random thought of we value football more than other sports, but recognizing that football is a significant revenue generator for the colleges and really matching that. I'd be curious to see whether that 75, 15 to 10, and so on breakdown really matches all schools. I would imagine it probably doesn't.
It probably doesn't. I totally agree with you. I think in some years your sport might make more money than another depending on their success. I mean, this is true in basketball. This is true in football. If your team isn't winning, I bet your ticket sales are down, right?
Right. And I think it's possible even if you're a D1 school and maybe you don't have, maybe football, just for whatever reason at that school isn't a high revenue generating sport. And so I think one of the things to talk with parents about is like, okay, well, what sport are we talking about? What sport is your kid in? And then kind of letting them know that these are kind of what we think is going to happen, but not necessarily. Like, you really have to look at the school and the sports that are there. I mean, I do think it's possible that a school could give the money more equitably. I mean, they're not being mandated to distribute it in that way. So kind of like Joy said, I mean, I'll be interested to see like whether that really plays out, like whether it really is, whether they end up doing like 75% to football, etc., or if they end up doing something else.
I think it'll depend and whether they can justify it under any Title IX challenges, because if one sport really isn't making that much revenue, let's say none of the sports are making revenue, none of them, because there's some schools that's how it is. Every sport is a non-revenue sport. They probably didn't opt in,
Yeah.
just so you know.
Yeah.
There's also state laws not all the state laws have complied with this so far, because prior to this, you couldn't give money to a student athlete. California has already updated 206, I think it's AB 206, to allow universities to, give student athletes money, because prior to that, it was not allowed. They could get third-party deals, but they couldn't get any money from the university. Now that's changed. So the state law had to now comply also, which I think, I don't know how many of them have amended. I'm assuming most, but I'm not sure. So that's another issue. So is there anything else you want to share with my listeners on Born to be a Sports Agent?
Yeah, I think in learning about this, we're recognizing how much college sports has changed. I know folks who played sports in college, and talking to them, this is a whole new frontier. So now that students can get compensation, I think thinking about financial planning with your kid is probably going to be super important. I think a common story from professional athletes is as soon as they get those checks rolling, they didn't know how to manage the money. And nobody taught us how to navigate taxes as an 18, 19, 20, 21-year-old. This is going to be affecting these students in particular, I think, much earlier, and they could be getting quite a bit of money, more than they maybe have ever had. I think that's going to be a few athletes, not all athletes, but some. And so thinking about financial planning is important. Young people that are in these situations are going to be treated as independent contractors, meaning they're getting 1099s. Taxes aren't getting pulled out. If you would have given me a check at 18, 19, I probably would have blown it. And then by the end of the tax year, had to figure out how to pay that bill. So having that conversation with your kid, maybe talking about setting aside 20 to 30% ahead of time to cover those taxes and make sure that they're not in a financially bad position at the end of the year. Talk to them about keeping records and keeping track of the money that they're making. And then this could have impacts on financial aid.
Interesting question. Yeah, that's.
I imagine, income for some athletes is going to be pretty different. And so would that then make them ineligible for financial assistance through the FAFSA, the next year? I don't know the answer to that. But all that to say, I think thinking through finances, having that conversation, and maybe seeking consultation a little bit earlier on those things than an 18, 19, 20-year-old would think of doing is probably an important move, especially if they're a really top recruit.
Yeah, I agree with you. Katie, I know you have two, how old are your boys?
Yeah, I have two sons who are high school, and they both do different sports.
Okay, but one of them is into one specific sport. Which sport is that?
My middle son is into gymnastics.
Right, and you just recently went to something, and that's where you started learning about this. Why don't you just explain to my audience as a parent, what happened in the recruiting process? Or I guess you were just attending a training or whatever you.
Yeah, it was a high performance camp that my son was going to at Stanford, just actually like a month ago. It's several days long. They do pretty intense training, like all day long. But the head coach had a meeting for parents of high school kids who were there to talk about kind of the process of possibly, getting onto a college team. And at the time, I didn't know, very much at all about like the house case or anything like that. And thinking about some of the things that he said now that I have this information, it makes a lot more sense because he was talking about how college men's gymnastics can increase revenue. So it sounds like, they're wanting to increase revenue so that they can give their athletes more money.
Exactly.
And so he's trying to think of, how can we do that, and like how can we play off like the Olympics that happen every 4 years. How can we maybe change the scoring at the competition so that it like basically makes more sense to sort of a lay person?
Yeah, because you said men's gymnastics, people don't understand the scoring, and so they're not as in tune to what's going on.
Yeah.
And how much of it is televised too. We talked about this.
That's another thing that he talked about, is wanting to get it more televised. If you think about like women's college gymnastics, it's much more out there. People know a lot more about it. I think also with men's gymnastics, there are 6 events as opposed to 4. It's just a little harder to follow along because it's very technical, and sort of only the people that do it really understand the skills and all of that. So it was interesting to hear him kind of thinking out loud with the parents about, their ideas so far about how they can increase revenue and pass it on to their athletes.
Got it. Okay. Is there anything else you guys want to add to share with parents right now?
I think there's maybe two other points. What is true right now may change, so keep on track, keep on top of what's going on with revenue sharing and NIL. There are some pending cases. There's a potential issue around, are students considered employees, or does that have other implications for what they should be entitled? So just stay on top of it. Especially if you have a top recruit, things will probably be changing quite a bit.
Yeah. Do you have anything you want to add?
No, I would just kind of say the same thing, and I think that's why it's really important for parents to have places that they can go to and easily access this kind of information, and from people who are keeping up on it, because it is moving, the landscape is shifting and moving so quickly, and it will probably be moving differently in different directions for different sports, you need people who are kind of constantly watching what's going on so that parents can have the most up-to-date information.
Yeah, and the NCAA has a lot of information on their website, and I think sometimes parents don't know about that. And if you right now are listening to this podcast, please share it with any parent you know that maybe has a student athlete that is being recruited or is maybe gonna be recruited. Because I think what's important is we get the message out there and that they understand that there is help out there, and all the help we just gave is free. So there is help out there. So just share it with your friends and your other parents. And I thank you guys so much for being on my podcast, Born to be a Sports Agent. Please subscribe and listen, and email if you have any questions for Jill. My email is jillbaxter@me.com. Thanks for listening.